Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and last time we talked about zones in permaculture, and we started to kind of get a bit of an understanding of what zones are, and you had some training homework to be drawing some maps of your yard and start marking where the light and shade are at different times of the day and throughout the different seasons. So I just want to remind you that permaculture it's more of an endurance race, right? It's not a sprint. All of this upfront research and design and redesign and sketching and things that we're going to be doing is going to help you to create a plan that's going to flourish once you start to put it into place in your yard. You got to go slow to be able to speed up, and that's one of the things that can be quite frustrating for permaculture, especially if you're somebody who is very action orientated and you just want to get it done. Like, I get it, trust me, I get it. I'm very much that person, but this is why this is kind of one of those things where if you're doing like a lot of design and planning type of activities, winter's a good time to be able to be doing that. And, you know, even if we're not going to be able to put in all of the plans and things that you're wanting to do within, you know, the next season coming up, which, you know, things happen, right? Like we definitely had different ideas of what we wanted to get done on the first year of our homestead. Other things came up, but again, this is like it's an endurance thing, right? You want to be taking your time, right? We don't want to go all out full throttle at the very beginning and then we don't have any energy towards the end of the project. So this is where, you know, we're kind of in, just because it's winter, certainly here in New England anyway, we've had snow and things show up already and more snow coming. But this is a good time for us to sort of reflect on how things have been working in the year, right? How, existing things that are in our garden, maybe it's trees that we've got, maybe it's fencing, maybe, you know, we've got some existing plantings that have already been in place, like what's working well, what's taking over, and, you know, what things are we needing to change. So winter's just kind of a reflective time anyway. And I find that kind of looking at permaculture things and how we can start to implement some of those activities can help influence some of the other projects that we've got coming down the pipeline. So if you have your map from last week where you started to mark out what your existing zones are, then I want you to think about what some of your end goals were that you wrote down from the first training for permaculture, because your zones are really the distance from the center, and that's where your home is in zone 0. And as we start to add things into your design, like elements or components as they're called in the permaculture and design world, your zoning might change. Like you might have a zone 1 area that's at the bottom of your yard because this is the place you visit every day to feed and give water and cuddles to the family's pet rabbit, for example. Or maybe that's where the chicken coop is, right? There's going to be some differences between every single backyard and every single home, right? Even if you've, you know, got a house that looks like all of the others on your street, the things that you're going to be designing and creating in your back garden are going to be very different from your neighbors, for example, just because of how you and your family interact with that space. So I want you to go back and take a look at those goals that you wrote down, right? What is it that you're wanting for your homestead, right? Maybe it's to have chickens, or maybe you're wanting an orchard. How often would you need to visit those things? And which zone do you think they would be in? Because in the zoning, right, the zones that are closer to the house, so, you know, those are things that are right up close. They're the lower numbers, right? So zone 1 is right outside of your back door normally, but it's things that need to be visited on a regular basis as well. So if you've got livestock or, you know, animals and things that, you know, you need to tend to them every day. You can't, you know, just kind of let them go off and do things on their own, right? You need to be visiting them every day. So your zone 1 isn't necessarily going to be, a concentric circle like donuts getting bigger, right? It's not going to look like that. It might be these weird shapes that you're drawing on your map because these are the paths that you're walking down. This is the area that you're visiting every day, right? Maybe you're taking a walk every day in a different area, right? Maybe you've got a little space that you like to go sit down and meditate in, or do yoga or whatever, right? Your zone 1 areas are going to change. Your zone 2 areas are going to change. Not everybody has got large scale trees and things and forested areas on their property, right? So not everybody's going to be getting up to a zone 5, for example, but a zone 5 might also be like a little area or pots or something, containers that are being left with wildflowers in them, for example. So it's kind of all down to, some ways of interpretation for how you are wanting to implement these permaculture principles into your yard. But also know that, these are just tools to be able to help understand how that land is being used, how you and your family are using the land, and what is going to make sense and be the most successful design when that information is translated into, okay, these are plants that are going to be wanted to plant, and these are kind of the groupings, and maybe this is where we want to put a shed, or this is where we want to put a chicken coop, or it kind of helps us think about some of the other interactions that are happening so we can execute the best strategy possible to help our homestead grow. So these are just tools, right? There might be a different way that you come to, a design that works for you, and that's okay, right? I always say there's many ways to grow your garden as there are gardeners on this planet, right? And just because this is kind of how, other people within the permaculture space are doing it, it's not necessarily like that cookie cutter, right? It's not one size fits all. So let's kind of talk about some of these things because, let's say a main garden, right? Often recommended to be right next to the house in zone 1. You read lots of different permaculture books if you're really wanting to dive into it. And I will be honest, some of these books read like stereo instructions. They're a little difficult to chew. But, a lot of the time, like even myself, I've recommended having a garden close to the house, especially if you're new, right? You can get out there every day. You can visit your garden. You can tend to it, do some weeding. You can check for pests every day. You can harvest it when it's needed and all that good stuff. Not every home is going to be able to do that. And I'll use my house as an example because right outside the back door is the septic tank and leach field. I can't put a garden on top of that. Like it's not, grass is pretty much all that can grow on there. And you talk to anybody that does leach fields and septic systems and they will tell you don't put stuff on top of it because you're going to reduce the longevity and the life of that septic system that's there. So they're an expensive thing to have to put in. So, you kind of want to be listening to that too. There's also, the other flip side of it is that it is dealing with waste items that are coming from your home. And aside from, the obvious of, it's coming from things from the toilet, people put things down the sinks all the time, and it may or may not be okay for the septic system generally, but it may or may not be okay for it to be, going into something that's then getting consumed, right? I'm not necessarily talking about bacteria and things, but, chemicals and stuff like that too. Like not all household cleaners, for example, they've not been made to then be, ending up into a waterway that's going to be feeding and providing nutrients and stuff for plants that you're growing. So these are things that you kind of want to be thinking about. And I know I'm not the only person that's necessarily got a septic tank and a leach field outside. So, you know, there's that aspect of it. But also, I mean, I don't want my 5 dogs running into my veg garden to go to the bathroom either. So for me, my vegetable garden is further away. It's quite far away, actually. Part of that's due to the septic system that we have, the dogs, but also the slope of my backyard. And because of how it slopes and the water moving, I've actually got to put my garden further away, so I know that there's minimal risk of, you know, contamination going into that garden. So my zoning and design has to take into account some of these things and how I'm using the land, and yours might do too. So I want you to take a look at your map and kind of think about, you know, where you might want to be putting some things. And for some people, like, this is kind of like a cool arts and crafts kind of thing. Like when I was doing my permaculture design course, like the instructor had us, like, you know, we had like little circles with, you know, different things in there. So there was like a chicken coop or a garden, or, you know, there was like an outdoor eating area and stuff like that. And we kind of had to, you know, put things in different places on this map. Some other people were a bit more creative, and they'd like had little, you know, things drawn out of felt. So there was like a little felt shed or something that you could put up on the board and put it in different places. But, you know, it's being able to kind of pick things up and move them around on paper and seeing what's kind of going to work for the space that you have. So, you know, for example, you know, if you're on a slope, right, putting a pond at the top of the hill doesn't make a lot of sense. Putting it at the bottom of the hill where the water's already running might make more sense. So having, you know, if you're into arts and crafts, you want to spend some extra time kind of playing around with your design, like that kind of helps. Obviously now with computers, you know, we can do some of those things using, you know, some different software and things that are available. And it doesn't even need to be that fancy either. You know, you could print something out and then use like tracing paper or something on top of it to kind of help you have multiple layers of a design. You can kind of see where you move things about. Like, make the design process easy and what works for you. I'm kind of a visual person. I kind of like doing some tactile things, especially when I'm working on my quilt, right? I am very much like, I need to have, you know, the fabric together and, you know, maybe even making like a little mock-up of things, you know, to be able to see what's going to work best. So do what works for you. But I want you to take a look at the maps that you've done, and I want you to take a look at the map that you made where you began to mark out the sectors on the map, right? So as a reminder, those are things like, you know, where your prevailing winds are coming from. Like, it's external factors that are impacting the area that you're looking at designing. Where does the water flow, right? Is it running off your roof and then onto the patio? Does it pool in the middle of the lawn? Is there a bad view of your neighbor's property that you want to screen? Like where I lived in New Jersey, there was a junkyard or a metal recycling center thing like right behind me. And it kind of sucked, right? When I was doing dishes or, you know, in the kitchen, like all I ever saw was just like this crane. And I mean, it was noisy anyway because of all the junk being moved around. But I remember thinking it was rented, and I was like, this was my own property. I would definitely want some trees there to kind of like screen that out. And I'd probably want some evergreen trees there to screen it out year round. So, you know, it's things like that, right? Is there stuff that is happening on your property already, and are there some things that you would want to preserve, right? Like where the water's running, or are there some things that you want to kind of screen out and remove, like a bad view, for example? Do you have animals coming onto the property? What sort of animals are those? Can you see where those are? And knowing these things and doing that sector analysis is going to help us use our design to leverage what is already going on, right? We want to use existing natural resources that are there. So we want to be using the plants and animals to provide fertilizer fertilizer or fuel or building materials. We want to be using them and leveraging them for pest control, weed control, building soil, recycling nutrients, right? Composting as examples. And plants and animals are providing a lot of resources in the ecosystem, and this is called stacking. And stacking can be as it relates to, the functions that they're doing, right? So you have like one plant or one animal, right? What are those things that it's providing in that ecosystem, right? There's a common example of the permaculture chicken, right? Of all the inputs that it needs and then all of the benefits that it's providing. But stacking can also be as it relates to height. So you can have a good example of this is talking about woodlands, right? So you've got a tall upper canopy tree, so things like your pines or maple and oak, right? Your timber providers. Then you've got smaller growing trees, so let's say they're like apples or pears. You've got fast growing smaller pioneer trees, so like staghorn sumac for me, might be autumn olive where you are. You then have a lower level where you've got shrubs, so it could be blueberries, currants, roses. It could be those kind of shrubby plants that are not, there might be things that are more decorative, or they're providing more green, right? They're providing lots of growth rather than, providing, plants that you can eat, for example. You then lower than the shrubs, you have things like perennial plants. There could be things like comfrey is an example. It could be ferns, could be whatever, like lower level, sort of shorter things growing, maybe 1.5 feet high. And then lower than that, you've got ground covers like, strawberry or clover. So you can stack plants according to the height and space that they're taking up. We can also leverage time and stack for time and stacking functions together. So like crop rotation and grazing are an example of this, or having legumes like beans and peas growing with grains. So we could use time, space, and function stacking to accelerate this natural progression of growth in an area, which is always kind of what we're trying to aim for in permaculture, right? We're trying to design the area so that it gets to that permanent long-term state quicker, right? Because that's where we're going to start to see the most, energy saving and stuff. Now, I know that sounds complicated, but a lot of things that we're already doing to accelerate this natural progression are things that we do kind of normally in the garden. So it might be things like cutting weeds before smothering them with cardboard to create mulch to create a new garden bed. It might be using fencing to stop grazers like deer from getting in and damaging, trees that you've put in. It might be planting hazel or sunchokes as a windbreak in a northern spot in the garden where the prevailing winds are, because if you can reduce that wind coming in, guess what? Your plants can establish quicker. It might be that you're planting different plants together in like a polyculture setting. So maybe you're planting sorghum and broom corn with cowpeas. Maybe you're sowing oats and field beans together as a green manure in your vegetable garden. Maybe you're just planting fruit trees near an existing tree in your yard and are leveraging the shelter that existing tree is already providing, right? There's lots of things that this can be, but understanding kind of how we can stack in time and space and function kind of gets our brains thinking a little bit differently into what plants we could be putting together, right? And there's some plants that I'm sure that you've already got in mind for your homestead, right? What are some of those things that you're wanting to grow in your space, right? Think about those, and what are some of those functions that you're wanting that plant to do, and what are the functions that plant is able to do, right? What are some of those main types that you're growing, right? Are you growing a lot of these nitrogen fixing plants, right? Do you have plants that are more long term? Like, are you looking at growing walnuts, for example? Is it something that's going to take a long time to provide a crop? What else could you be growing whilst that is getting established to generate a crop or generate more out of that space? There's Are there things that need a lot of monitoring? Like, do you need to be out there checking on their growth quite a lot? Or is it something that's a bit less intensive, right? Like an orchard's a lot less intensive than, a vegetable garden, right? Because once you've got your trees planted, you're just really waiting for them to get established before they start to provide fruit. So pull a list together and start thinking about how the plants help each other grow, right? Like legumes. So they provide nitrogen in the soil for other plants to grow. So that's your bees, beans, and peanuts fall into the legume category. Are the plants that you're wanting to grow tall, like corn? Can you use them to provide trellis or support for another plant? Do they cover the ground like squashes or clover? Are they spiky and thorny? Like, could they be a barrier for wildlife? So start thinking about what some of these plants do. And stacking is one of those exciting parts to permaculture design, right? What are all of the things that your plants could do? But it's also one that can get the most overwhelming, right? It's somewhat easy to look at like a shed, right? And think, oh, these are the functions that this shed is going to perform, right? You can leverage it for harvesting water when it rains off the roof. It can be used to store things that you need to be kept nearby. You could use it to have plants growing up it as a support, for example. You could use it as an entertainment area, right? It just all depends, right? It's easy to kind of see that. But when you start thinking about, plants or animals and what benefits they bring and what they're able to provide, it can get a little bit overwhelming. And this is where starting small is really great, so you don't get too overwhelmed. Plant guilds are often a small project that's recommended because they're easy to do in a small space. They're easy to kind of design because you can narrow it down by what plants are able to grow in your area and what plants you would like to have. So one of the great things about permaculture is, a lot of these kind of design ideas that are being leveraged in sort of a tropical area, they can be applied to other climates just by switching out plants that are native or that thrive in those different areas. So let's talk about an often recommended example, which is an apple tree growing with herbs and spring bulbs. So the herbs might be garlic chives, comfrey, lavender, and dill. And spring bulbs, I don't know, let's go with daffodils. I like daffodils. And, you grow those around the outer drip line of the tree. So that's like the outermost edges, and then like if you were to draw a line from where those outermost branches are straight down to the ground, that would be a drip line. It's basically when it's raining, like where's the water dripping to? So you've got those plants all growing around the outside, and then inner towards the trunk of the tree, you've got maybe, clover growing, for example, as a living mulch. So the herbs provide seasoning, they provide food or medicine, as well as a habitat for beneficial insects, right? Dill especially, like lots of beneficial insects like dill to be growing. So, you're bringing in a method of pest control as well as providing, you and your family with additional products there. The herbs also help pull up nutrients deeper in the soil and can provide a mulch, right? Like comfrey. So comfrey's got a long taproot that helps to aerate the soil. There's like taproots and things can help encourage different animals in the soil, like earthworms and stuff like that, from coming into the space. You can chop comfrey down a number of times throughout the season. It will grow back up again. You can use those leaves to help smother leaves and provide additional nutrients because that comfrey is pulling up those nutrients from deeper in the ground. Clover is providing a nitrogen source. It's fixing nitrogen in the air into the soil. So it's providing a source of food for the plants growing nearby, and the flowers are a source of food for many insects. The spring bulbs, so daffodils, they're providing an early nectar source for early insects, but they also help to stop grass from encroaching in on an area. So they're providing a barrier as well. And obviously the tree is providing shelter as well as food for local pollinators when it is blossoming, and food as fruit for us, or maybe, animals that you have on the property. So, the plants that are in there, they're growing at different heights and different levels, but you've got different benefits that are being stacked in there as well. So there's a lot going on in, a relatively small area there. So that's why a guild is often recommended. And a permanent guild, like in this example, might not work for your yard. So how about designing a garden bed to leverage stacking instead, right? What are plants that are low growing? What's a tall growing plant? Could you grow those things together? Like, could you have, taller cabbages and then, lower growing spinach growing underneath, right? You're kind of stacking with height there. Could you use time to grow a succession of plants in the same bed? Where could you add habitat for beneficial insects? How can you add in improving the soil in that same bed, right? So I want you to kind of have a bit of homework this week and start drafting some designs with those important goals and functions in mind. So what is it that you wrote down at the first training about what are the things that I really want my permaculture homestead to do and to have? What are those key things that it needs to have? And start kind of, just kind of sketching some ideas out of those important goals and functions, right? It might be just a garden bed, right? And it might be planning for next season, but you could be adding in some of these other permaculture thoughts in there. Like how could you leverage, a green manure or beneficial, herbs or flowers in your current garden? Like how can we start to leverage some of those things? Maybe you're doing something a bit more involved. Maybe you're designing a permaculture rabbit pen, or maybe you had an idea for a greenhouse chicken coop at some random late hour the other night, like I did, right? Sketch out some ideas and start listing some potential plants or potential functions that you're going to need to have from this. Think about how your plants are interacting with each other. And, if you're designing with animals, how the animals are going to interact with those. What are the benefits that plant or animals providing? Think about how nutrients and water are going to be used in that design as well. So share your ideas over in the Facebook group if you're comfortable. I'd love to see them, especially if you also got the greenhouse chicken coop idea. Like, I would love to see if somebody's got some ideas around that too. That would be kind of cool. But I know this is kind of slow for people, and permaculture is one of those long-term things, but there are smaller projects that we can do to leverage some of these skills and start practicing that we can then implement in the wider area of our permaculture homestead. So I would love to hear from you. Let me know. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful week, and I hope your garden grows beautifully.